1792. This is a big year. The Kingdom of France was working its way through the French Revolution, and this involved the social virtues of liberté, égalité, and chopping people's heads off. You could say this wasn't exactly the most peaceful time, because the lower classes were trying to fix what they saw as a corrupt and outdated social order through any means they could. A lot of the clergymen and nobles in France were already seeing the writing on the wall and getting the hell out of there before things got bad, but the French King Louis XVI was still kicking around. He was busy trying to save his head by playing along with the demands of the newly formed and democratically elected Legislative Assembly, who were now calling all the shots. In April of 1792, some of the people in the Assembly, including the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Charles Dumouriez, went on a giant rant about how much France's neighbors sucked, and with the support of Louis XVI, the government decided to declare war on the Kingdom of Austria. By the way, keep this guy in mind. He'll come back up later. So why did the French government just go to war with Austria? Well, when you think about it, when your country is literally on the verge of anarchy, throwing the violence outside the country rather than inside of the country is a really good idea, and having your people unified against a common foe was some powerful symbolism and was sure to increase French morale and stability. So, with this in mind, the French invaded the Austrian Netherlands, betting on a really quick victory. But the French army was not feeling so good, and they were ridiculously unprepared. A perfect example of this was at the Battle of Valmy. After a bunch of French troops came in sight of the Austrian troops, the French general ordered them to withdraw. But when the French turned their backs, the Austrians opened fire, and even though they were well out of range, the French still panicked, dropped all their equipment, and made a run for it, thinking that their general just set them up or something. It was all just a giant misunderstanding, but the troops took this for treason, and they decided to take matters into their own hands. The only casualties of the Battle of Valmy ended up being the French general and his staff, who all ended up being put to death by their own men. The Austrians, meanwhile, didn't lose a single soldier. Why was the French army behaving like this? Well, most of the troops involved in the invasion were civilian volunteers, and they were loyal enough to the revolution, but they barely had any actual fighting experience. So you can put two and two together and say they didn't make the best soldiers. What's worse, most of the people who actually knew how to lead an army had been educated nobles. Like those same nobles that happened to be running away from France at breakneck speed. This caused a huge brain drain in the high command. Looking at how things were, it's shocking to me why the French even considered going to war with Austria at all, and it was about to get even worse for them. Austria wasn't the only country in Europe that was mad at the French. The Kingdom of Prussia was watching from the sidelines, and they'd been taking notes. After the shenanigans that just went down in Belgium, they were probably laughing their butts off. They were already ready to jump on the continental bandwagon against the French, and this just gave them confirmation to do so. So by summertime, France had not just an Austrian, but a Prussian army on its doorstep too. Keep in mind that this was the same Prussian army that just decades earlier made headlines as one of Europe's best armies under Frederick the Great. So when word got out that they were now making a beeline for Paris, the French lost their shit. The people in the government started name-calling and accusing each other of treason. And among the accused were some of the absolute last military commanders left in France who were actually competent, men like the Marquis de Lafayette and the Comte de Rochambeau. They were forced to flee abroad to avoid the guillotine, and their leaving just made the situation for the army even worse. What's more, mobs began raiding prisons and murdering the people inside them on the basis that they were enemies of the state that were going to help the Prussians once they reached Paris. Some 1,200 people died in these senseless killings, and the government did nothing to stop them, because some of its members were even involved in those killings. At the same time that was all happening, the coalition army entered France. They were being led by the Duke of Brunswick, who was considered to be one of the best generals of the time. He was a Prussian aristocrat who wanted to put an end to the anarchy that was the French Revolution, and to restore the king to real authority. For the Legislative Assembly, the autumn of 1792 was some darkest hour shit, and they absolutely needed to get to work on fixing their army if the revolution was going to make it out of this alive. Like I said earlier, There were giant holes in both the upper and lower command structure. The main reason that the invasion of the Austrian Netherlands sucked so bad was that most of the soldiers involved were untrained citizens. But believe it or not, there were soldiers of the old Royal Army still kicking around too. The revolution kind of disorganized them, but the government absolutely needed their help, so they started to integrate them with the new volunteers. When you think about it, this is actually a really smart formula. The Royal Army soldiers were older and more experienced, but their loyalty to the revolution was questionable. On the other hand, you had the younger volunteers who were eager to fight, but weren't professional in any sense of the word. You get the best of both when you combine these two into one army. You can see what I'm talking about in this painting of the upcoming battle, where you have the old Royal Army soldiers wearing their white coats, paired right next to the new citizen army and their blue coats. So, with the lower army structure patched up as best as it could be for the time being, it's time to look at the upper army structure. Remember how I said most of the educated generals and officers in the army had packed up and left? The government started appointing new people to fill these posts. Only this time, they weren't based on their nobility, but rather on how good they were on the battlefield. The generals of the two armies that were about to face Brunswick were Francois de Kellermann and Charles Dumouriez, who, if you recall from the beginning, was that guy who was trash-talking Austria in front of the Legislative Assembly. Both of them had proven their worth to the revolution on the battlefield, and it was their two armies that the government ordered to link up and stop Brunswick from reaching Paris. While they were on their way to do that, the Germans reached the fortress town of Verdun without much trouble on the 2nd of September. The road to Paris was wide open, but Brunswick's movement was pretty slow, and Dumouriez was coming in hot from the north. Making do without Kellermann, he took the initiative and occupied a series of crucial passes in the Argonne Wood that the Germans would have to pass through. He boldly declared that this position was going to be his Thermopylae, but in reality it was more like his Ardennes, because the Germans unexpectedly broke through where the French weren't expecting. Dumouriez just packed up and went southwest, towards the towns of Valmy and Saint-Menehould. He settled on a spot where he could easily choke off Brunswick's supplies if he decided to make a dash for Paris, and he was finally joined by Kellermann and his troops from the south on the 20th of September. Instead of rushing towards Paris, Brunswick decided to swing down to face the French armies, and there was now no question that a battle had to be fought. There were about 34,000 coalition soldiers ready for this battle. For the French, it was a little more complicated. Technically, they had about 54,000 soldiers, but thanks to a lack of coordination, Kellermann had accidentally deployed in front of Dumouriez. The situation was made worse by the fact that there was a swamp in between the two armies, so there was little that Dumouriez could do to actually help. Thanks to this, the French actually had about 32,000 soldiers ready for this battle, and Kellermann chose to dig them in along two ridges, the southern one having a windmill on it that he ordered burned down so that the coalition army couldn't use it as a landmark to coordinate their artillery towards. Fun fact, that windmill was rebuilt after the battle, and you can visit it today. The morning was foggy, so no one was really doing anything until about midday, at which point the artillery of both sides started a long-range duel. Casualties were pretty light, because the distance between the two was pretty far. Brunswick broke the awkward tension by sending his troops forward. He was probably thinking that the French would break at the sight of a professional army, just like they'd done in the Austrian Netherlands. But the French wouldn't budge this time. Brunswick decided to send his men back and just continued the artillery duel. A few hours passed and nothing happened, but then, one of the Prussian cannons scored a lucky shot by hitting one of the French ammunition wagons and causing a loud explosion. Brunswick then sent his men out again, hoping that this would finally cause the French to break. Except it didn't. Kellermann was helping French morale by raising his hat and crying out to his soldiers, "Vive la nation!" Long live the nation. The troops began to copy this chant, along with singing the French anthem as the Prussians advanced. This was quite a shock to Brunswick. He was not at all expecting this kind of resistance, from the French of all armies. But this was their home territory, and they were not about to give up any more French soil without a real fight. So Brunswick turned back and said, "Geschlagen wir nicht," which translates roughly to "we will not fight here," and the coalition army stopped their advance. The Germans had lost just 164 men, and the French around 300. A few days later, the coalition began their retreat back towards Germany. There would no longer be any march on Paris, and the coalition had just lost what was probably their best chance of strangling the French Revolution in its cradle. When they got news of the upset victory at Valmy, the Legislative Assembly in Paris, now replaced by the National Convention, was pretty relieved. Just 2 days after the battle, they formally declared the end of the French monarchy and did away with Louis XVI. The propagandists had a field day with this battle, since they got to describe the heroism of the citizen soldiers as they fought valiantly against a foreign invader. And I mean, the Battle of Valmy wasn't really that epic or groundbreaking when you look at it. Brunswick didn't really do much, there was no great offensive, no huge losses, and no bold maneuvers. But that's okay, because sometimes the idea of victory is more important than the victory itself. Or in other words, the psychological effects of the battle were way bigger than the physical. Valmy may not have been a breathtaking victory, but it might as well have been, because that's how the French chose to remember it, and they would use the example of that victory to inspire actually breathtaking victories that happened down the line. The German poet Johann von Goethe was there to see the battle, and I'll end the video with his words. From this place, and from this day forth, commences a new era in the world's history, and you were there at its birth.